In Jefferson County last week, the reformers, well, they got recalled. Matter of fact, in almost every school board election, recallers or reformers lost. To talk about that and what that means for reform, Ross Izard from the Independence Institute. It was not a fun Tuesday last week.
It was a bad night.
It was a bad night. Why? What happened?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When you sit down and you look at this stuff, you had Jeffco, which went really poorly, and we all saw that happen. You had Thompson up north, which went pretty poorly, and we all watched that happen. Then you had this whole constellation of other districts, like you said. So you had D11 and D38 down in the Springs. You had Mesa over on the western slope. You had Adams 12. It was just a really bad night.
When you say bad night from a perspective of those who want more choice in education, want to see more charter schools,
right,
want to see less union control and more parent control.
Sure, that's exactly right. And I think, you know, there's kind of batted around the media after the election the term conservative reformer as if it's sort of this pejorative or a term that we shouldn't say. I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, I think those folks would be happy to say that that's who they are. And just like you said, they were up there fighting for choice for parents, so more charter schools. They were fighting to equalize funding for charter students, be more fiscally responsible. They were doing good stuff.
All right, now I was close to this election. And what's fascinating for me was that the personalities, particularly on the school board in Jefferson County, were not well liked. They were very well disliked. But the reforms that were put in pulled off the charts. People in Jefferson County loved the idea that they built a school without going into debt. And I don't think people realize what a sin it is to build a school with cash when you could use debt and make the crony system very happy. They put in pay for performance. They gave teachers bonuses. They put in a merit-based pay system. They equalized funding for all schools, public schools. That meant that charter students got the same amount of funding as other public school students. People loved this, but they hated the board. Why did they hate the board so much?
I think that's an interesting question. You look all around the state, it's the same thing. You have folks who really dislike the board members, and then they really, really like what the board members are doing. And I think the fundamental reason for that is that there were some personality problems, which I think you were hinting at earlier, where we had some missteps fairly early on, particularly in Jeffco with the AP US history fiasco that happened last fall. Although it pays to mention that JCEA, right after the election, that's Jeffco's local teachers union, put out a statement saying, you know what, the second these guys were elected, before they ever sat down, before they ever cast a single vote, talked about a single policy, we were laying the groundwork for this plan. And sort of in true fashion, never let a good catastrophe go to waste. They seized on that.
And that AP history thing was a PR catastrophe. I mean, it was a debacle, and it seemed to have taken the oxygen out of the room for any sort of reasonable conversation about policy discussions.
Completely agree. When you took a look at that, I was sitting in the office when that happened, and we had these kids walking out and running through traffic in the streets, literally in a lot of cases. For the first few days, nobody even really knew what was going on. You had folks on the street saying, we're out here because we don't believe in pay for performance and we don't think this is right. A few days later, all of a sudden it was about censorship in AP US history. And by the time it all shook out, it didn't really matter that the College Board said, well, actually, yes, the framework probably could have been better and made some changes. The damage was done.
For those who don't know, the College Board actually runs advanced placement or AP curriculum. And so they said, after the fact, not just from Jefferson County, but from around the country, we're having problems with this new AP history curriculum. Teachers don't like it, students don't like it. And, you know, maybe we should mention George Washington's name or the Cold War in history classes. We're going to go back and redo it. So they were right, but the way it was handled, it makes me wonder, it's more how it's done, not what's done.
I think so. I think process matters. I mean, the policies matter. I think the values behind the policies matter in a big way in terms of talking about fairness for teachers and choice for parents and all that good stuff. But process matters. I mean, if you're going to go through the steps A, B, C, D, and E, and then you also need to go through the rest of the steps and get where you need to be, that's just something that you have to do. And I think getting folks involved in the community and really teaching them about what you're trying to do, but then also, more importantly, why you're trying to do it, that's a huge step.
You mentioned that the union put out this gloating email to its members and said this was all part of the plan. The minute these guys won 2 years ago, we had a plan to oust them because we can't have equal funding for non-unionized schools. We can't have pay for performance. I mean, heaven forbid we actually pay teachers like professionals and not like factory workers. The unions were there and they were ready to jump on it. What's so funny is that the union-backed candidates, at least campaigning, had to sound just like the reformers, but more polite. Do I have that part right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially in Jeffco, toward the end of the recall proceedings, you had folks who were getting up on public panels and saying, these are folks who were going to replace the people they were trying to recall.
These are the union-backed candidates.
That's right. And they get up on a podium and they say, look, you know, charter schools are great. And they kind of split the baby on what constitutes this type of charter and that type of charter. And then they went on to say, of course I wouldn't think about rolling back equal funding for those people. You had other folks who...
Stop there for a second. Every single candidate, not only the ones who were already in office that were being recalled, but all the ones who were running to replace them, each and every one of them said they were not going to redo funding for charter schools. So the new funding levels, they all pledged would stay exactly the same.
They did. That was the promise they made.
What was the difference between the two, policy-wise?
I don't think that there is a difference policy-wise. I think that what you're looking at here is, to your point, this is political interest. I mean, you look in Jeffco and you look at the money that was spent in Jeffco on the recall. You look around the state, you have tiny Thompson up north with 16,000 kids. You had a big old independent expenditures committee, fancy term for a committee that comes in and spends a bunch of money on electioneering, spent about $200,000 to kick these guys out of office and flip that board. And this is what happens when you have people come in and challenge power structures that have been in place for a very long time. It has nothing to do with policies. It has everything to do with power.
It's just amazing to me that in order for this recall to be successful, the recallers had to at least pretend that they agreed with all the reforms these reformers were doing. They said they like pay for performance. You know, we just need to talk about what that really means. They all said they were not roll back the funding. So in order to win, they had to sound like the reformers. Now, my suspicion is, once they get comfortable, they're going to talk about what equal funding really means, which means rolling it back, or how to do pay for performance in a way that everybody does well, like in Lake Wobegon. That's my suspicion.
I think you're right. I mean, we've already had somebody, Ron Mitchell and Jeffco, come out and say, charter school funding,
this is a likely new president of the board.
That's right. He's the guy who was just elected to come in after the recall. And he is out there already saying, well, we need to revisit what equal funding really means for charters. And I think that's a simple question. Equal funding for charter kids means equal funding for charter kids. But those are the type of conversations that they're going to have. But the truth is, even when they have those conversations, I think that the sort of policies that people are willing to talk about and the policies that folks are willing to accept, I think that those have branched out in a way that they're never going to be able to roll back. So you might see some incremental changes in terms of maybe they go back and they change the great union contract that Jeffco has now to be a little bit less great. Maybe they start talking about rolling back charter funding, but the truth is I don't think they can ever go back, and I think they know that.
When you say they can't go back, what do you mean they can't go back? Go back to what?
So go back to the way things used to be with unequal charter funding or with steps and lanes pay systems that are based off of stuff that...
English for me on that one.
Apologize, being too nerdy. So steps and columns are the way that we normally pay teachers and under union contracts. This has been in place since basically the mid-20th century. And it essentially says if you have existed in a classroom for this amount of time, you make this much money. And if you have this amount of educational hours or a degree, you make this much money. And it doesn't much matter how you're actually doing it.
It's basically the salary schedule. And I don't think Coloradans understand that these teachers are incentivized to stay in the system as long as they can and to grab up as much extracurricular classes as they can. None of this is a measurement on how well they actually teach your kids.
Right.
And so a pay-for-performance system pays you on how well you're actually teaching our children. And teachers who are good teachers love pay-for-performance because they can get paid like a professional. And that's happening now in Jefferson County. It's happening now in Douglas County. Will that be reversed?
Not fully, no. I think you're right to say that they're going to go back and take a look at this and say, well, maybe we can tweak it this way or we can tweak it that way. But no, I don't think so. I don't think they're going back to that old structure.
All right, so for people who want to see reform in education, want to see teachers treated like professionals, want to see equal funding for all public schools, including charter schools, was last week's loss just over and done? Go home, pack it in, time to move to another state and try over there?
There are probably some people who had that thought, but I'd say no, absolutely not. I mean, it was a bad night, and we're not going to sugarcoat that and say that it went better than it did or that it was anything other than what it was, which was a whooping. But the truth is, I think that it was more a lesson in how we ought to be communicating and how we ought to be going about implementing these policies, and less sort of a mandate against reform. And so I think that once folks have kind of gotten their heads straight again and kind of gathered their senses and remembered why we're in this game, I don't think you're going to see very many people running away at all. And in fact, I think you're going to see some folks being emboldened by this.
I found it fascinating that the national unions had to come in here with potentially millions of dollars because parents decided to reform their schools on a local level. I found that encouraging. I almost found that affirming.
I think absolutely. You look at, these are massive, massive structures that are out there. The NEA, the AFT, these are huge, huge political machines. And the truth of the matter is, if you're going after a giant, you don't go for the neck, you go for the ankles. And I think that they were recognizing that what was going on down in the local districts, where you have gridlock in Congress, you have gridlock at the state legislature, down at the local level where people are touching this stuff, they get it.
And they were changing their education systems for their kids.
Absolutely.
For the better.
And these folks recognize the danger in that. I think that's where the money came from.
Ross, thank you. Look for the Independence Institute at independenceinstitute.org. Tell a friend, and by all means, we'll see you next week.